Good morning, everyone. Hope you're all having a wonderful day today. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the Riton X5 Tactix 1 to 10 by 24. This is an optic that is trying to do a little bit of everything, and it succeeds at some of it. Now, full disclosure on the Riton 1 to 10 is that they did send this optic out to me for free, so I did not pay for it whatsoever. Now, the way that I got in touch with Riton is actually through an advertising agency that I've done a lot of work with in the past for a lot of different companies, and they've stuck with me through a lot of positive and negative reviews. That's a little bit of foreshadowing, but the point being is that there is a relationship there, and on top of that, I have actually talked to some of the engineers at Riton about this scope specifically. Now, getting into the specifications of the Riton 1 to 10, this is a very big optic. So this is a 11.5 inch long body. It's 6061 T6 aluminum, 30mm main tube, and the weight comes in at a whopping 26 ounces, which is definitely on the heavier end of LPVOs and kind of heavy for scopes in general. Of course, the trade-off there for that size and weight is that we are getting a 1 to 10 first focal plane optic. Now, the Riton 1 to 10 is manufactured in China, so this is a Chinese body, Chinese glass, and the glass is pretty good, even though it is manufactured in China, though we'll talk about that a little bit later on. Now, actually getting into the controls on the Riton 1 to 10, at the back of the scope, we have our diopter for adjusting the reticle to your eyes. That is going to be very important with such a wide magnification range. Everybody's eyes are a little bit different, so you want to make sure that that reticle is as clear to you as it can be. Now, moving forward from there, we have our magnification ring, and this is where things start to get a little bit weird in a few design choices that they did. So the magnification throw itself is 210 degrees, not 180, so it's a little bit longer of a throw from 1 to 10. Probably has something to do with that very large magnification range. Now, on top of that, as you can probably tell, it does come with a throw lever. It actually has several different heights as well. I believe the one that I am currently using is the 16mm, which is the tallest option that they have, which is quite good. It does give you a lot of leverage, allows you to throw it very quickly. The throw itself is very smooth, which is nice because this is about $1,000 scope depending on where you get it from. So it feels very nice, and the actual magnification ring itself has this very aggressive knurling in it as well, so you get a lot of grip on it. Now, Riton does give you 2 locations on the magnification ring where you can install your throw lever, and of course you can completely delete it if you don't want it. Unfortunately, neither of the positions works very well. For instance, in the more usable position, which is where I have it currently, where it is at a 90-degree angle off center, if you have your offset red dot mounted further back, the throw lever will actually interfere with your red dot and make it to where you can't actually get all the way to 1x on the Riton 1 to 10. The second position, which will work better with an offset red dot mounted at the back, as you can see here on mine, I have the red dot mounted forward on the fairly decent Geisley knockoff rail on this PSA Saber, but we'll get into that at a different video. In the secondary position, however, if you are all the way at 10x magnification, the throw lever is perfectly underneath the optic, so if you're using a shorter mount, it actually won't fit there at all. And of course, it's actually sitting at a place where it's very difficult to get to if you're using that secondary location. But it will work better with an offset red dot if it's mounted near the magnification ring. Neither one of them is perfect. However, again, the more normal position, the more usable position is how I currently have it set up, so that you can still use it whether it's on 1 or 10x magnification, because again, on that secondary location, it's actually flipped underneath the scope body a little bit, and it's very difficult to get to, kind of defeating the purpose of having a throw lever in the first place. Now, of course, they do offer different heights for the throw lever, and if you don't want to use them, you can just completely delete it and not use it at all, which might be the best if you're trying to mount a red dot near the actual magnification ring. And of course, the magnification ring is machined well. It is very workable, it's smooth, so even without a throw lever, it is still usable. Again, some of the design choices are a little bit odd in terms of their placement, and with that very long 210-degree throw, it does cause just a couple ergonomic issues depending on how you're using it. But again, if you have it set up like I do, or you're not using an offset red dot, then it's probably not going to be that big of a deal to you. Now, moving forward again, we of course have our capped windage and elevation. Now, this is a mil optic. The reticle on the inside is of course in mils, so the turrets are also in mils. You have 0.1 mil adjustments, which is quite nice. And of course, if you did want to, you can zero them as well. The clicks themselves are very nice. They're not mushy at all. They feel very nice for an LPVO. So if you did want to dial with this optic, you certainly could. Now with the reticle that they include in here, it's very well thought out. It works very well for me personally. So, and I believe you have 10 mils within the reticle and of course wind holds as well. So I don't really feel the need to dial on this style of optic. However, it is there if you wanted to. Now this is of course an illuminated reticle, and we have settings 1 to 6 with an off in between each setting, which is perfectly fine. That means you can always hang out at least one click away from where you actually want to be, which is again a nice feature to have. Now kudos to Riton for this, but they did include probably one of the most powerful emitters that they could, which does make the reticle usable in a lot of different circumstances. Definitely a nice feature to have. However, with some of the stuff going on with the reticle, there are still certain scenarios where it's just not quite enough. So now let's go ahead and talk about actually using the scope, starting off with the eye relief and eye box. Now, some quirks here are going to be specific to me personally. I am not someone who likes to run their stock very far back. I usually like it 1 or 2 clicks back, and that's how I like to run it 99% of the time. However, the eye relief on the Riton 1 to 10 is extremely long. I believe they rate it at 4 inches, and its optimum is much closer to 5 or 6 inches, meaning that a lot of the times I had to run my stock almost all the way back. Now again, that is a personal issue. That's not an issue with the scope. That is just something about me personally. I am fairly short. I'm 5'7". I do not have particularly long arms. So for me, having a gun running this long is just a little bit less comfortable, even though the eye relief is very, very long. Now the eye box on 1X is also very good. You have a good amount of up, down, left, and right. So when it comes to usability, you have an extremely long eye relief, which I think will benefit a lot of people. It does hinder me a little bit, but again, the average person is going to really enjoy having that longer eye relief, and the eye box, the up, down, left, and right, is also quite good. Now that is talking about the 1X performance. Now, one problem with a scope like this is that it is just using a regular 30mm main tube, which means that you have a smaller 24mm objective lens. A lot of the 1 to 10s that I've tested and liked use 34mm main tubes, which gives them a 28mm objective lens, which gives them about 20% more forgiving of an exit pupil, which usually translates to having a more forgiving eye box and eye relief. Now at 1X, doesn't really matter all that much. Very usable, very long eye relief, very good eye box, very forgiving. Where that really comes into play is when you want to get higher into the magnification range, and this does go all the way up to 10X. At 10X, you have a very, very tight optic. It is usable from a stable position. However, if you're not quite as stable, if you're, say, shooting off of a barricade, you're trying to brace up, or you're just standing using it from the shoulder, it can be very difficult to get a good sight picture through the optic. And that is because we have a smaller, not smaller, but a more standard 30mm main tube versus a 34mm main tube, like on a lot of other 1 to 10s that I've liked. So the 10X is already punishing on those scopes, but on the Riton 1 to 10 is extremely punishing. Now from a stable position, prone with a bipod, something like that, or a really good braced position, it's going to be usable. You can definitely get into position and use it. However, again, it's just going to be much less forgiving. Now again, the eye relief itself at 10X looks very good. It's a very long eye relief, but you really do not have much forward or back whatsoever before you start to get that black ring around it, and your up, down, left, right in terms of your eye box is also extremely tight. So it is much more difficult to use on 10X. Now, this is a first focal plane optic, meaning that you don't have to be at 10X to utilize the reticle. So if you don't need it, you can be at 6 or 8, and at 6 or 8, you still have a very forgiving eye relief and eye box. Though again, that eye relief is still extremely long. So again, usability from 1 to 6 or 7 is what I would consider to be very good. But as soon as you get up into the top end, 8, 9, 10, it starts to be very tight and very punishing, especially if you're shooting from odd positions. Now, getting into field of view, it is rated at 105 feet at 1X at 100 yards. 105 feet is perfectly fine. It is acceptable. However, it's certainly not exceptional. A lot of other LPVOs that I've used recently have been anywhere from 115 to 125. 125 is top tier phenomenal. All the way down at 105 is certainly usable. Again, it's just nothing special. Now, getting into the best and worst part of the Riton 1 to 10 is going to be the reticle. Now, this is of course a first focal plane optic, meaning that as you increase in magnification, the reticle will increase in size proportionally. So at 10x, you have a very precise, very crisp looking reticle, gives you a ton of information. The drops and everything, which we'll get into a little bit later on, are all very nicely sized, very, very precise. The problem is, as you dial all the way down to 1x, they are darn near microscopic, meaning that a lot of the times, even with the illumination on maximum, in full daylight, you get to play the game of where is the reticle at 1x, because the reticle is so small, and even though the illumination is trying its best and it is quite good, when the reticle gets that small, it is very, very difficult to actually figure out where it is, which is one of the reasons why I'm running an offset red dot. Now, between 2 and 10, the reticle is very, very usable at mid to long range, let's say. The problem with it is that 1x setting, the more I used it, the less I liked it. Now, they did certainly try to make it a little easier to pick up at 1x. You do have these fairly decent sized posts kind of drawing your eye to the center, but as far as like where that reticle actually is, again, it can be very, very difficult to tell precisely where you are. You can just put those posts at a target at like 10 or 15 yards and you're probably going to hit it just fine. However, at say intermediate distance, if you need to take a quick shot at a small target at 50 yards, not being able to see precisely where that reticle is can be a big issue. And again, the more I use the scope at 1x, even with illumination on maximum with fresh batteries, it wasn't quite enough to be fast as I would like. Now, getting into a little bit more detail on the reticle before we press on, in the center at 10x, we have a very nice, precise floating dot. Again, it looks very good at 10x. It's still very nice and crisp. Surrounding that, we have a segmented circle horseshoe thingy that does help to draw your eye to the center a little bit. It doesn't really do much at 1x because it's so small, and at 10x, maybe it gets in the way just a little bit, so maybe it's a little bit too busy around there, though again, it's a very hard compromise getting a reticle to work at 1 and 10x magnification on a first focal plane optic. Now, below the center dot, we of course have a mill grid slash Christmas tree slash very usable set of dots. So I believe we have 10 mils of drops in 1 mil increments, and we also have half mil increments on our windage, all the way out to I believe 5 or 6 mils at the bottom of the Christmas tree, which is way more than you'll probably ever need unless you're shooting extremely long range with like a 22 or some other rimfire-esque caliber. And really the only features that the reticle itself is missing is some sort of auto ranging brackets or something to make it simple for dumb people like me. Now, you can of course use mills to do a lot of different auto ranging with a little bit of math, but that is above my pay grade. This is actually the second 1 to 10 that I've had. The first one that I had a very noticeable fisheye effect, and I actually talked to one of the engineers about it. He was very proud of the 1x performance on his optic, so they actually sent me out a new one. And this new one does have a improved 1x, could have just been something going wrong a little bit internally or something like that. But this new optic, the 1x performance, the 1x image itself, looks good. It's not the flattest, most perfect image that I've seen. However, that is one of the trade-offs of having a 1 to 10. It's just going to be a little bit more complex on the inside. So the 1x image is good. However, the reticle size is holding it back a little bit, and it is going to be a little bit slower than other optics. So while this is a 1 to 10, in my opinion, it suffers from a visibility issue at the low end and a usability issue at the high end. So it is definitely punishing you at the extremes, which is one of the downsides of having a LPVO with a 1 to 10x magnification. It is very, very hard to get right throughout the entire magnification range. Now, the last thing that we should talk about is the glass quality itself. As I mentioned earlier, this is a Chinese manufactured optic. However, the glass quality is pretty darn good. Riton is very happy about the coatings and the light transmission that they post on their website, and the image does look very good. Now, this is an optic with an MSRP of, I believe, $960, and at $960, there are a lot of better looking scopes on the market. So the glass quality is certainly good. It didn't hold me back in any way. You could definitely tell that there's a little bit of optical degradation at the high end, of course, but it was certainly fine, certainly usable, though again, just not going to be the best in class. Now, getting into durability on the Riton 1 to 10, of course, I did do a double drop test on this optic. On top of that, I have owned it for quite some time, and I put a lot of rounds through it, and so it's held up perfectly fine in that regard. Now, when we talk about the double drop test, I of course first start out with a control group at 50 yards, 5 rounds. Then I do a shoulder height drop onto dirt and rocks. This is about the hardest drop that most optics / guns will ever encounter in a realistic circumstance. If you accidentally drop it or get hit or fall over or trip or something, that's about the hardest real world impact that your optic is going to take. And after that, it held 0 perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. Now, the second drop that I do is borderline unrealistic. However, keep in mind that a SIG Romeo 5 will pass it. Now, usually for LPVOs or higher magnification scopes in general, the shoulder height drop onto an AR500 steel plate is kind of a pass-fail test. If they survive the drop, that counts as a pass, and of course, about half of them straight up die. Now, the Riton 1 to 10 passed the drop test. Now, it did survive. It did crush the top turret, which is actually sitting on the windage right now. So it completely deformed the elevation turret because it did take the brunt of the impact. We did have a shift in 0 of 6 mils straight up. So whatever the drop was, whatever happened internally, we had a shift in 0 of 6 mils straight up. I re-zeroed it, 6 mils straight down, and it was perfectly fine, good to go. No issues with the body bending, no issues with the glass, nothing cracked, nothing bent. It is 100% usable, but if it experiences an insanely hard drop, you are going to have a very, very noticeable point of impact shift. So again, not perfect, not what we'd like to see. We'd like to see no point of impact shift, no damage, of course. So if you do happen to find yourself in that somewhat absurd circumstances, you should have a fairly high confidence that your optic is still going to be usable after you re-zero it. Now, when we put all of that together, we have a 1 to 10 first focal plane optic that does a lot of things very, very well. And it also does some things very poorly. And it's hard to recommend changes at the 1x that won't affect it negatively at the 10x and vice versa. Now, one of the things in the design phase is I would probably recommend a larger tube size to give you a little bit more forgiving of an exit pupil, so going to a 34mm main tube. However, that is probably going to increase the cost and the weight. Keep in mind that this is already 26 ounces, which is a very heavy LPVO. In fact, that is heavier than the Maven 2.5 to 15 that I tested last week. And for $1,000, I do think that it's a rough sell. Fortunately, Optics Planet is selling it for sub $700. I think it's $680 at Optics Planet. You can save 7% using code FOCUS at Optics Planet. And at sub $700, I think that is much more attractive. It is still not a perfect scope. It's trying to do basically everything between 0 and 800 yards. And at those extremes, it's not quite ideal, though again, if you're trying to just build the ultimate 16-inch 14.5 do everything gun, and I mean literally do everything gun, then this is a optic that can do it. However, I think it is best in conjunction with a offset red dot or a top-mounted red dot, which is going to increase your cost and increase your weight, which is already very high. As far as would I recommend this LPVO to most people? Absolutely not. This is going to be a very niche optic for a very small set of people. Again, I think that the reticle works very well. 1 to 10 magnification is very nice. The illumination is good. The eye box, eye relief, very forgiving on the low end. It does tighten quite a bit up at the high end. There are just so many pros and cons to the optic that on paper it might sound like one of the best optics you can buy, especially sub $700, but in real world use, at almost every level, every magnification level, and every use case, it just has a lot of downsides. Size and weight, you're never going to be getting away from that. The 1x performance is good in terms of the glass quality and image, but it's held back by the very, very small reticle. 10x, the reticle is perfect, but now it's very difficult to use unless you're in a very stable position. Durability is there, feature set is there, but for every positive that it has almost an equal and opposite negative. So it is an interesting scope. It is a scope that I have used for a while, and again, in sort of a mid-range setting, it works very well. But then if you're going to go mid-range, then you might as well go with like a 2 to 10 or a 2 to 12, something like that. And you can actually find those optics that are lighter than this as well. And if you're already consigned to going with an offset red dot, then that's probably a more ideal solution. But with all that out of the way, guys, let me know what you think of the Riton 1 to 10 by 24 first focal plane LPVO, because that's about all I got. So once again, thank you so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed. I will see you in the next one. God bless.